All right. Well, thank you very much for joining me on the Meet My Network podcast. I'm Michael Doran. I'm the founder of Team Sourced. I've been a recruiter for over 25 years. I'm originally from the Chicagoland area, moved out to the Bay Area about 13 years ago to work at Google. Since then, I've worked with a lot of VC-backed high growth startups, started my own business. And I'm super thrilled to bring into the podcast Mary Kay Baldino. She is from the Chicagoland area. I have been aware of Mary Kay pretty much my entire career. There are names that you hear in like regional recruiting hubs and recruiting spaces. And Mary Kay was certainly one of those. So hi, Mary Kay. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi. Nice to see you, Michael.
Nice to see you as well. It's great to talk with you today. And I'm sitting here taking a look at your LinkedIn, and my gosh, is it extensive. So I thought maybe a good place to start
Sure.
was talk about what made you become a recruiter back in 93 at Famous Footwear.
Well, honestly, I started working actually in recruiting even earlier than that.
Oh,
I
really?
worked full time while I was in college,
Mm.
and for freshman year, my career advisor was the head of the career center and was trying to advise me on how do you declare a major, how do I make sure I have enough credits over the years, and asked me what did I want to do when I graduated. I'm like, I'm a freshman. I've got 4 years to figure that out. And this was the first adult in my life to tell me that maybe I should try to figure it out before I actually graduated from college. So I started actually using the resources of the Career Center. And since I already knew I was going to have to work my way through college, I decided I would try to narrow down my career choices. And I did. And the only thing that all of those things had in common was personnel. 'Cause back
Ah,
then, it was often not called HR. So I'm
'cause that's
doing,
pre-staffing personnel, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
personnel,
Mm.
pre staffing, pre HR, technology changes over the years.
Yep. So you just went right into recruiting then?
I did. I went right into recruiting while I was still in college in an agency environment and was working my way through school doing that. And then once I graduated and several years of experience, but then and people were ready to hire me in more than just an entry level job. So I skipped some of the, I think, what are often typical career steps for
Mm.
people coming right out of college, where they start as a coordinator or they're doing a support role in recruiting. Um, but I was lucky to get some good career related jobs while I was still in school.
So it looks like you started corporate and then you went to agency for a while and then you went back to corporate. Do you wanna talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I did. Sure. So I went into corporate at Famous Footwear. I stayed in corporate for a while. When I was at Manpower, I was actually working in their corporate offices. So I was
Oh.
like internal HR for one of the largest temporary agencies in the world, which was super interesting. I worked across all of their different businesses. This was early RPO days. They had perm placement, they had temporary placement, and they were huge global organization, and I was in corporate HR.
And so it looks like you got promoted into management pretty early. Can you
I
talk to us
did.
a little bit about how that happened for you?
Yeah. It happened because I started pointing out problems with our recruiting process.
Oh.
We we were not using a lot of technology at the time, and I felt like we really needed to, improve how we were going about recruiting and provide a much higher level of service to our hiring managers. Everyone in HR was more or less a generalist at that time at Manpower, and so I learned the hard way that if you complain enough to the right people, you get the job of fixing it. So they created the very first corporate recruiting function and put me in charge of it. And it was my very first people leader role. And I had to quickly learn how to start a new function from scratch and how to lead people at the same time, which was a little intimidating, but I was really excited by that too.
What would you say was the most surprising thing that you learned when you first became a recruiting leader?
I think that the most surprising thing that I learned that I hadn't anticipated, I anticipated maybe some of the challenges of transitioning from an individual contributor to a people leader role. What I hadn't anticipated actually was how much I needed to actually focus on compensation and job architecture issues. ended up doing a lot more writing of job descriptions, job analysis work, and trying to figure out compensation levels in order to empower my team to be able to take an incoming requisition and have it make sense and have it be scoped correctly before it came into the recruiting process and managers were pressuring to say, I just got to get this position filled. I learned early that I needed to go upstream on those kind of issues.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. Was there a specific moment or a mentor that really significantly influenced your recruiting career?
The person that I really remember that stuck out from my time at Manpower and who really gave me the opportunity to be in that role was their chief operating officer. He was responsible for HR, legal, a lot of corporate functions. And David really he believed that I was smart enough to figure things out. And he gave me a lot of latitude to come up with ideas and was also available to let me run those ideas past him, poke and push and advise me. But I never felt like he was ever squashing me or ever putting any of my ideas down.
Mm.
He would give me advice that would let me get to my own conclusions about which ideas were actually gonna work, so,
Oh, that makes
that
sense.
yeah.
Well, was there a skill that you wish you had developed earlier in your career that you felt could have benefited you when a little bit later?
Yeah, I was a liberal arts went to a liberal arts college, and I didn't take any business classes, and so I really wasn't until I actually got into management that I really learned much about budgeting in a corporate environment. I didn't really learn basic financial management skills, how to put together a business case for things until I was already in a leadership role. I wish I'd had more either education or exposure to budgeting and financial planning earlier in my career.
So it seems like you spent a good portion of your career in the insurance industry or
Yes.
segment. Was there a specific
Yeah.
reason for that, or was that something that you just fell into early and then you found that you just really enjoyed?
I think I initially just fell into it, right?
Sure.
The right type of job, kind of job content wise, came along at the right time. And then I discovered that there was a lot of meaning in working in an industry. The US healthcare system is pretty broken.
Mm.
And I felt like I was able to try and hire smart people who had a mission to make it a little less broken, make the healthcare system more accessible or make people's dollars stretch further in a lot of cases. So and once you learn an industry, it's also very easy to then transition to another company in that industry and know how to make connections with senior leaders, know how to speak in their language, right? You understand enough about the key jobs and the key financial drivers of that business that you can have an impact very quickly. So I think that's also been part of it for me is that there's been this connection point in or around the insurance industry for a lot of my career.
Gotcha. And so, what function, like looking back across all the recruiting you've done, is there a specific corporate function that you really enjoy recruiting for?
I've always really enjoyed working with technology leaders.
Okay.
I like experimenting with technology myself. I've always been very interested in sort of the operations aspect of recruiting and things like building websites or looking at how you can optimize your technology to better support your processes. And so I think that interest in my within my own work kind of stretches into that same interest across the whole company and the business. So I've always enjoyed companies that were very data and technology driven, and that's been one of the common denominators across my career is looking for those kind of companies that are investing heavily in that kind of space. And now, even now, like I'm interested in companies that are experimenting with AI and other kinds of technology, big data kinds of
Yeah.
companies. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what are some of the biggest challenges that you feel are facing recruiting teams right now?
I think one of them is the labor market continues to shift and change, and it's certainly shifted away from being a labor market that favors job seekers right now. I see a lot of TA teams being cut. really cut to the bone. And so, how do you do more with less, right? You have to be really thoughtful and strategic, for example, about things like how long do you post a job for? Is it actually smart to leave it up for very long? Do you even bother posting every job? How do you plan in advance well enough that you can build a pipeline of candidates instead of just passively waiting and getting surprised by what's coming in through the business requisition process? So I think that it can be very hard when you're operating on kind of a low resource mode within TA to think proactively, but it's even more important to think proactively when you are feeling
Proactive
under-resourced.
recruitment's like the holy grail of recruiting. It's something I've very
Mhm,
rarely been able to obtain. Like, how do you get executives to buy into allowing you to be proactive and finding the talent that they might
mhm.
need down the road now?
Well, I think it's difficult to do that in most companies because I don't think that most business leaders that I've worked with really can translate their business strategy into specific talent needs. I've seen it happen in pockets, right? So there's this holy grail of having strategic workforce plans,
Yeah.
but I've never seen it happen holistically at any company that I've ever worked at. What
Why do
I've
you think that is? I mean, these are very large, very
Yeah.
successful companies making a lot of money. And I've seen the
Mhm.
same thing where it's almost like they don't know what they need 9, 12, 18, 24 months down the road.
That's right.
Why
Um,
do you think that is?
Yeah. So I think there's a couple of reasons. One, I think that there has historically been this approach of labor, talent is something that we can always buy more of, right? We will always be able to buy more of it. And if you look at historical trends, that b- has been pretty much true, right? Companies have, when they needed to, been able to go out and just buy more talent.
Mm.
But I think the demographic trends are gonna work against that kind of a approach over the next 20 years. We've got a shrinking labor force in a lot of countries.
Right, and that's what they
Yeah.
keep saying, though we don't necessarily see that because of the disruption for the last few years. They're saying that the battle for talent is just gonna get more and more fierce from here, as especially as more baby boomers retire and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, the demographics are working against having the same number of people. You don't have the same number of people coming into the workforce that you have exiting the workforce, right? So
Yeah.
just demographic shifts. And so companies have also been going through this continuous process of looking at how do we do more or the same with fewer resources, right?
Mm,
So using jobs that used to exist, data entry clerks. So many things don't exist anymore because of technology,
mm,
because of automation, and you need fewer workers in a knowledge economy than you do in a more manufacturing driven economy, that kind of thing. Even in a manufacturing economy, so many things now are very technical jobs because they're really utilizing AI, robotics, things like that in order to manufacture things, right?
yeah,
So we need a smaller but very different, very highly skilled workforce
mm,
in the future compared to the past. I also think that what I've seen from companies' strategic planning processes is that there's often not enough segmentation discussion when it comes to companies' workforce.
mm,
If I sit down with business leaders, one of the questions I like to ask them is which single job or job category is going to drive all your profits this year? And
mm.
they often can't answer that. They
Wow.
either they're not sure. They're not sure. Or they wanna give me an answer that is like 10 jobs. But there's always jobs that are the difference maker in any market for any company. And
Sure.
so if you can really strategic workforce planning is connecting the dots between the company strategy and those jobs that are difference makers. And so I have seen parts of organizations that I've worked at invest in really understanding those jobs, understanding those talent segments at a deeper level in a data driven way, right? So that they could do longer range planning And that helped a lot with not only talent attraction, but with upskilling and retention of those workers, so that you could know that you would have a competitive advantage because those were the people who were going to make the difference in the long run about whether or not you were going to grow, and regardless of what your company strategy is. So I just think it's a part of strategic planning that most corporate strategy professionals have no training in at all. I think often HR, where you sometimes find people with this kind of training, um, don't get a seat at the table, right?
Mm.
And that the focus of strategic planning is more on goals, execution of those goals, et cetera. And it doesn't usually get into a lot of talent aspects.
It's interesting. I put out there that I feel smart companies and maybe companies in the future should also be led by CEOs who are recruiters.
Mhm.
And the reason I say that is because traditionally, from what I've seen, executives have come out of sales or finance,
Mhm.
maybe sometimes operation.
Yep.
Out here in Silicon Valley, they come out of engineering.
Sure.
But from my perspective, nobody knows a company as well as the recruiting team. They're the ones who know all the hiring managers. They're hiring all the people. They know what all the cogs are. They know how all the cogs work together. And they've been raised by HR to operate within more of a compliant framework and structure. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I'd love to see somebody rise through the ranks from recruiting into senior leadership. I don't think very many CHROs come from recruiting, honestly.
I'm doing a project
Yeah,
on that right now. I got a list of like the 230 top CHROs, and I'm like in my spare time, I'm researching every single one of their
right.
background, and I want to put together a report like how many of these top 200 CHROs actually came from recruiting,
Yeah.
because I'm gonna bet it's less than 1%,
Or
if it's even
right,
1%.
or they were in recruiting so long ago that they have no practical hands-on experience with how recruiting operates in a modern
Right.
internet-based era, right? I think that yeah, I think
Yeah.
very few CHROs that I've worked for have come from anything other than either compensation or business partner relationship management types of roles. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Yep.
interesting. Well, let's switch gears
Sure.
here a little bit. When you're building out a recruiting team, and I see that you're new at Morningstar, so I'm sure you've been there 3 months now so far, I guess. You're getting your feet underneath you, doing your executive assessment, starting to get
Yep.
things going. What when you're building a
Mhm.
recruiting team, what qualities do you look for,
Mhm.
when you're hiring recruiters?
I am always looking for an insatiable curiosity. I think that one of the common denominators across all the really great recruiters I've worked with over the years is that they are intensely curious people. They're always willing to ask yet another question, and they ask interesting questions. They ask challenging questions. They ask well, I one of the books that I have read fairly recently, it's called A More Beautiful Question. And so they ask more beautiful questions. They ask the questions that really matter. And so that curiosity, that drive that to need to know more is really important. And that ties together with a lot of other interpersonal skills. If you're genuinely curious about people, you can build connections more quickly with both candidates, with hiring leaders. You'll better understand at a deeper level the business and how it makes money and how it works and how to find people with the right skills. You'll learn all of that stuff more quickly if you're intensely curious and asking a lot of questions. I look for recruiters who can really be advisors to the business. They're not transactional. They're not there to just push buttons in the ATS. They've got a continuous improvement mindset, not just about their own career, but really about all of their day-to-day work. And so they're often the ones who are pushing leadership on making investments or making improvements to your ATS or to how you're marketing jobs, to what your career site looks like. They can be demanding from a people leadership perspective, but they're always some of the most valuable people on the team.
Well, let's extend that a little
Sure.
bit. So looking at your recruiting team overall, how do you measure
Mhm.
success for
Yeah.
them?
Well, from a metrics perspective, I tend to not be very interested in what I think of as traditional recruiting metrics. I have a Lean Six Sigma background. I've done a lot of process improvement work. And so, one of the things that I think is always the case is I'm always interested in looking at not the average of things, but variation around the mean. And so, instead of looking at time to fill as an average, I look at what was a target hire date for that position? When did the business need to have that position filled in order to meet their business goals? And then did we or did we not have that person start on time? I think managing the variation and the variance against targets is way more meaningful than measuring the average of stuff. Once you start to get into larger and larger numbers, and you're looking at the average, it just becomes BS anyway because you can hide a lot of variance by just looking at the average. So I think it's important to keep track of target hire dates in your ATS and measure that percentage of times when you are missing the mark. I'm
That
interested
makes sense.
in understanding how assessments are really working or not working. Interested in understanding things like time to source, right? I'm interested in understanding the type of outreach that recruiters are doing. So, how are they sourcing and bringing talent to the table? Are they investing in building out diverse set of connections, right? So, I think a lot of companies focus on things like in the diversity recruiting space, diversity of slates. If you only focus on the outcome kind of stuff, you never really get everyone's attention focused on the stuff that delivers those outcomes. So, how do you instead move upstream and say, let's focus on whether or not you're consistently doing outreach and building your network and diversifying your network, right? So, it's often about looking at both the variance and then how do we go upstream from the outcomes we want and give people goals around the stuff they can actually control.
I wanted to run something by you. So, one thing that's been working really well for me for the last 4 or 5 years is actually doing all of my outreach as the company leaders that I'm supporting. But I found that it's giving me the best opportunity to get a signal through the noise. And when I started doing this 5 or 6 years ago, people were very reticent. I had to do a lot of
Mhm.
convincing, more difficult. And even more recently, I worked with a client who's owned by a really large traditional aviation company. And just because we had the Google and Microsoft single
Yeah.
sign on, they're like, okay. Like, what are your thoughts about doing things like
Mhm.
that, trying to innovate in terms of
Yeah.
processes and also trying to get a signal through the noise, but then you're also building that executive's talent network,
Right.
right? And you're going to build their network out, which undoubtedly they would be doing themselves, but we both know that recruiting is 5% of their
Yeah.
job. And they've got a lot to do.
Yeah, I think that's really smart, Michael. I think that the actual hiring managers are who the candidates most want to hear from. Right. So
Mhm.
especially when you're doing
Yeah.
proactive outreach, you're going to automatically get a much higher response rate if you are reaching out as an actual decision maker, right? I say this all the time, but recruiters are actually making very few decisions about
Yeah.
who gets hired. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. I think everybody needs to know while we are the
Yeah.
gatekeeper, we have very little
That's
power.
right.
Like, when we're just bringing the parties together. It's really interesting. When I was at Dropbox, I was working with them right before they went public, and I did a bunch of investor relations
Uh-huh.
recruiting, and I found the only other function I think that is as close to recruiting because they're in the same
Mhm.
position. They're bringing 2 different parties together, but they have absolutely no control over the outcome of the process. And when I interviewed a bunch of IR people, I'm like,
Yeah.
"Oh, you guys are just like
Yeah,
recruiters."
I love working with IR people
So
because they understand the importance of employer brand in a really unique
yeah.
way. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, what skills do you think will be most important for recruiters over the next 3 to 5 years?
I think recruiters who are not experimenting with AI and ways to use AI to make themselves more efficient. So I think technology adoption and experimentation is really important.
How is AI currently changing your recruiting processes?
Yeah. So the low hanging fruit in recruiting, I think, is first of all, starting with automating routine tests. Interview scheduling has been something that you could automate for a long time now. I don't understand why any company is still manually going in and setting up Outlook calendar invites and all of that kind of stuff. This is been an opportunity for AI and even that kind of thing for a long time. Using chatbots to reply to candidates, recruiters get a lot of very repetitive questions.
Yeah.
So why why not let a chatbot interact with candidates, right? Using AI to quickly sift through a database and help you surface content, including resume content and other kinds of content, really good use of AI, right? I like to use AI to create rough drafts of presentations and other kinds of documents because you can get something started really fast. Does not need you
Yeah.
good There's no such thing as a good first draft usually, so you let AI help you get started, and then once the ball is rolling, you'll find that you make progress on things, but having a bad first draft is okay, and so that's been a simple example. So those are really low level, low hanging fruit kinds of things. I don't actually believe that AI can do a better job writing job posting content or recruitment marketing content than people. But I do think it can proofread and I do think it can go out and pull together examples. So if you're looking at, I need to market this job in this market, and here are the talent competitors where I'm going to be going and targeting their people. What AI can do is pull together a lot of research on the talent competitors, how they're advertising their roles, do a comparison for you of different companies' job postings for those roles, and summarize it a lot faster than doing it yourself. So I think that research phase, and let's face it, recruiting depends very heavily on research skills, can be sped up at least by using AI to do some of the grunt work of pulling things together.
Yeah, I completely agree. I got together with a client who had turned me off, and then they were getting ready to grow, I think about the middle of last year. And I was meeting with one of their hiring managers and they couldn't figure out the title. And I almost went back to my old way. Well, let me do some
Uh-huh.
research. I'll send you a follow-up email. And I was like, well, wait, why don't we just work with Chat GPT for a
Right.
minute and figure out some
Yeah.
titles? So I screen share and put the
Yep.
prompt in and choose the questions. And we sat there and looked at the titles and we decided on the title we want. I put it into the intake
Yeah.
form and well, done,
Even
and
yeah, you can even ask ChatGPT or other AI tools to say, "Go out and tell me figure out which of these 3 or 4 different titles are gonna be the most effective in search engine results." You
yeah,
can pose a question like that, and it'll go
right.
test it out, come back to you with the data and say, "Looks like this one versus this one, and here's how they compare." Right?
Mm.
So, again, it's about asking a smarter question. It's about learning how to ask AI smarter questions and like think about that in your day-to-day work. Is this something that AI could help me do more efficiently? And all of those little things start adding up. I don't know why anybody still manually takes interview notes, for example, when
Mm.
you can get AI summaries. You still need to probably edit them, and you gotta always carefully review them, make sure they're accurate, but there is so much that you don't have to sit there and manually type in anymore.
Well, I gotta tell you, I completely agree. When I went through a high volume period with this one client, like, maybe about a year and a half ago, I was starting to get real burnt
Yeah.
out. But I pride myself on being able to type 90 to 100 words a minute. But I have my head down and I'm typing and I'm researching things and I'm not really engaged. And so when they came back and we started working again, I very quickly am like, I got to start using AI. And the good word of mouth that what I recommend to people is I worked with Otter, I worked with MetaView, and I worked with one other. And so I always had three different AI note takers going as I was trying to figure out which one I
Uh-huh.
liked and which one I don't. The answer is Otter. I prefer Otter. But what I found is that 90% of my stress was now gone from the
Yeah.
call. I could sit and talk just like I'm talking
Yeah.
with you, I could be more engaged. I could keep eye contact with the
That's right.
people, not worry about notes. And also it took away 90% of the stress that I had previously. And all of a sudden I found I really love recruiting. I love talking to people. I love
That's
interviewing
right.
people because it first gotten rid of that hardcore manual input
Mhm.
component. And so I think that really illustrates part of the good of
Mhm.
AI. What concerns do you have about AI in recruiting?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that you can't have that AI be a black box. It's
Sure.
just like those note taker things. You do have to monitor how is it summarizing this interview? Is it accurate? Is it fair? Is it a good reflection of the actual conversation? Things like that, right? But and if you're talking about inserting AI into selection decisions, you have to be able to audit and see what's going on, right? And not have things disappearing into a black box and you can't audit it. You can't understand whether or not you're inserting not that interviews are a super accurate or fair way to select people in the first place. I'm like, well, if AI
Sure.
can actually make us less biased and less
Yeah.
unfair, that would be good. But I do think that all of these things add up to people being able to do the work that only humans can do. Connecting, making eye contact, asking the next great question, asking the right follow-up questions. And if you are more focused and on doing that than taking notes, then that's a good thing, right?
So it sounds like you're more of an AI boomer than an AI doomer. You feel that AI is going to be augmenting recruiters, making their jobs more
I think
fulfilling.
so. I think I look again, I have this Lean Six Sigma view of technology, like it's there to support a
Yeah.
process and to remove as much wasted effort out of the process as possible. And so I've seen technology evolve over the course of my career, very long career. I remember the days of fax machines. And so I've just seen that technology evolve in interesting ways where continues to strip away the things that take recruiters' attention away from building connection, building
Yeah.
relationships, adding value to the process, and that's only a good thing in my mind, and I don't think that AI is going to replace recruiters because I don't think AI is going to be able to replace human judgment and relationship building and connection. I think we are social creatures and we will always need that in our companies, in our communities, etc. But if it can strip away the stuff that distracts you from building connection with people, that's wonderful.
Yeah. And I think if it can surface more people, if it can get rid of these closed gardens, so to speak, of professions and companies that it's impossible to get to and be a little bit more egalitarian, I guess, in that
Yeah.
aspect. Are there any specific recruiting tasks that you believe AI can't replace? And I agree with you. I think when it comes to
Yeah.
career, that's a big decision in people's lives, and I think that they're gonna want a human being in the loop.
Mhm. Right. I don't think AI is gonna be great in the immediate term at delivering meaningful feedback to people. It might help them with self-insight, right? So if you look at some of these AI note-taking tools, they can help like a hiring manager or a recruiter develop insights into what they're doing well and not doing well in their interview style, in their interview approach. That's a good thing. I think that self-insight is really important precursor to growth and development. But I don't think that AI is gonna be able to actually coach people
That's interesting. I've not heard anybody say that before. That's because it just doesn't have the depth of knowledge and experience.
because
It's
coaching is
just
also
kind
an
of
interactive process, that
sure,
requires some insights.
not just predicting the next word it needs to say.
Exactly. Yeah. If it could if
Gotcha.
coaching could be turned into something more transactional, maybe you could get AI to do it, but AI doesn't, at this point anyway, anticipate or understand when somebody needs a response to their emotions versus their logic.
Well, we're
Yeah.
almost done here. I just want to ask you one final question. What keeps you passionate about recruiting? You've been doing it
Yep.
for a long time. What keeps you?
I've always loved recruiting and I've had these side detours into other areas of HR throughout my career, but I always come back to it because it is first of all, if you do it well, every other single thing in the company goes better. It is as far upstream as you can go in terms of contributing to company results. So it's always felt like very impactful work to me. I love seeing people get new opportunities and what they do with those opportunities, how they develop their careers. That's always exciting. And I also think that unlike a lot of other areas of HR, recruiters and TA leaders, they spend more time thinking about the external marketplace than most of HR. Most of HR has a lot of stakeholders, no doubt about it, but those stakeholders are primarily internal stakeholders, hiring managers, executives, employees, right? And recruiting has far more stakeholders who are outside of the organization. And we have to be thinking about those stakeholders all the time. And I think that makes recruiting unique, effective. Yeah.
Well, Mary Kay Baldino, obviously
Yeah.
wonderful conversation. It's thrilling to get to meet you. I was telling her before we started this podcast, I've been aware of her for years because I came from the Chicagoland area. I'm glad that we get to put a face to a name finally. You've given us,
So glad.
yeah, you've given us a lot of insight here and shared a lot. And I just thank you for your time.
So great meeting you. And it was a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much.